$1 million if you can read this letter, Claire Whitmore said, holding the old envelope above her head so the whole ballroom could see it. The guests laughed. In front of her stood Caleb Foster, the janitor she had just humiliated. Caleb pulled off his gloves, took the letter, and read the ancient Latin aloud without a stumble, then translated the warning inside about power and human decency. The laughter died. He handed it back. Maybe the man who wrote this understood power better than the woman who owns it now. Claire couldn't breathe. The night shift at Whitmore Industries began at 6, and by 6:15 Caleb Foster was on the 14th floor with his cart. He worked the way men work when they have decided the job will not define them, efficiently, without conversation. Most of the executives who stayed late had seen him 1,000 times and could not have described his face. To them, he was the sound of wheels on carpet and the smell of clean water. He was 38, and he had been a widower long enough that people had stopped asking. He took the long shifts because they paid, and because an empty apartment at 11 at night was easier to walk into than an empty apartment at 7. Nobody at Whitmore Industries had ever thought to ask where he had been before Seattle. Still, the picture didn't always hold. When a vice president screamed into a phone about a collapsed deal, Caleb kept mopping, and something in the steadiness of it made the man stop screaming. A woman from accounting once said he had the calm of someone who had already survived worse than anything in that building. She meant it as a joke. She was not entirely wrong. The gala was held on a Friday in the ground floor atrium under glass and cold white light for the 10th anniversary of the death of George Whitmore. Photographs of the founder hung in black and white above 400 people in evening clothes who had never worked a day beside him. Caleb had been pulled onto the event crew, clearing glasses and running trash to the service corridor, and he had been on his feet for 9 hours. Claire Whitmore stood near the center of the room with a champagne flute she had not touched. She was 34. Her father had been dead 10 years, and for 7 of them, Margaret Caldwell had run the company from the board chair, holding it together while Claire was told repeatedly that she was not ready. 3 years ago, Margaret had moved the votes herself and put Claire in the chief executive's chair, which meant every compliment Claire received belonged to somebody else. Your father would be proud. George built something remarkable. Margaret did a fine job keeping the seat warm. She smiled through all of it, and by 9 o'clock she was carrying 100 small stones. The shareholders were harder. 2 of them had cornered her at the bar and spent 11 minutes explaining politely that the quarter had disappointed the board and that some people were beginning to ask whether the chair had been filled too soon. They said it kindly. That was what made it unbearable. Margaret found her afterward, the way she always did, and put a hand flat on Claire's back. She was 68, silver-haired, and had a way of lowering her voice that made whatever she said feel like protection. "They're frightened men with small portfolios," Margaret said. "Don't let them ruin your father's night. Smile, get through the toast, and let me handle the rest." Claire nodded because she always nodded, and she was walking away when it happened. A guest turned too fast near the serving table with a drink in each hand, and his shoulder caught Caleb square in the back as Caleb was stacking used glasses. The tray tipped. A full glass of red wine went across the front of Claire's dress, and the small wet impact, then the shattering on marble, cut a hole in the noise of the room. 400 people turned. Claire stood there with the stain spreading across silk that cost more than most of the catering staff made in a month, and for 1 full second she was completely still. Then something that had been compressing all evening found an opening. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Caleb had already set the tray down. The guest who caused it was 3 steps away, watching, saying nothing. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Let me get someone from the front desk to help with the dress." "I don't want the front desk. I want to know how somebody who pushes a cart for a living walks through a room like this without noticing where he is." A few people laughed, the kind of laugh that comes out of discomfort. It gave her the room, and once she had the room, she kept going. "You know what this is?" She gestured at the photographs, at the glass ceiling. "This is a company, built by a man who understood that everybody has a place. Your place tonight was to stay out of the way. That was the entire job." "Yes, ma'am." "Don't do that. That polite thing. I'd rather you argued." Caleb looked at her then and did not look away, and there was nothing hostile in it at all. That was the problem. He was not afraid of her, and he was not performing humility for her, and she could see both facts clearly and could do nothing about either one. I apologize for the dress. It shouldn't have happened. The room waited. Somewhere underneath the anger, Claire understood she had already won and should stop. But she had a ruined dress and a board counting her failures and her father's face on every wall, and the only thing available to her was the man with his sleeves rolled up. She reached into the clutch under her arm. The envelope inside was ivory, soft at the corners from age, and she had been carrying it for 6 weeks. It had come out of her father's desk when they finally cleared his study, and she had meant to read from it during her remarks that night, and hadn't, because in 10 years she had never once been able to understand it. 4 lines of old Latin in George Whitmore's handwriting. She had never asked anyone to translate it. Asking would have meant admitting there was a part of her father she couldn't reach. "All right," she said, raising it over her head. "Here's something better than an apology. This belonged to my father. Nobody in my family has ever been able to read it." Her voice carried, clean and cutting. $1 million if you can read this letter." The laughter came back, louder. Margaret Caldwell laughed first, warm and indulgent, the way a woman laughs at something charming, and the rest of the room followed her lead. Someone near the bar said something about hiring a translator with the tip money. Caleb pulled the gloves off his hands, one and then the other, and folded them into his back pocket. He took the envelope, opened it carefully at the seam because the paper was old, and held the single sheet under the light. Then he read it aloud, not haltingly, not stumbling over the endings the way a man does when he is guessing. He read the Latin the way a person reads a language they have lived inside, with the stresses in the right places and the clause breaks where the writer had put them, and the sound of it moved across the atrium and landed in a silence that came on like a door closing. He finished the last line, lowered the page, and translated. "A man who holds power but forgets his own humanity will in the end be swallowed by the shadow that power casts." Nobody laughed. Somewhere at the back, a glass was set down on a tray, and it was the loudest thing in the room. Claire's arm was still half raised, holding nothing. She looked at the janitor she had just spent 90 seconds diminishing in front of every shareholder she needed, and could not find a single word. Caleb folded the page along its original creases, slid it back into the envelope, and held it out. "I don't want the money." She took it. Her hand was not steady. "Maybe the man who wrote this," Caleb said, "understood power better than the woman who owns it now." Then he picked up his tray and walked out through the service corridor. The video was online before midnight. By Sunday, it had 11 million views. Whitmore Industries issued a statement about a private moment taken out of context, and nobody believed it. Claire watched the clip 40 times that weekend, not for the humiliation which she had absorbed in the first hour, but for the 8 seconds in the middle. She had sat in that room with venture partners and senators and 2 Nobel laureates, and not one of them could have done what the man with the mop had just done. Who is Caleb Foster? On Monday, she pulled his file herself instead of asking anyone to do it, and that was the first small thing she did differently. The recent history was invisible. Contract janitorial work, 18 months. Warehouse shifts before that. Seasonal loading, delivery driving, a few months at a hardware distributor. The resume a man assembles when he is not building toward anything but staying afloat. And above all of it, a gap. Years of nothing. She went further back past what human resources kept and found the thing that explained the atrium. Caleb Foster had studied history and classical languages, deep enough that his name appeared on academic work about medieval Latin manuscripts. Then the trail stopped, and the next thing that existed was a warehouse in South Seattle. That answered one question. The second thing she found made her put down her coffee and not pick it back up. The father's name was listed, Thomas Foster. She knew it before she finished reading it. Thomas Foster had been an investigative journalist, the kind whose byline used to end careers. More than a decade ago, he had spent almost 2 years on a single story, Allegations that a Whitmore Industries chemical plant outside Tacoma had contaminated the local groundwater and then falsified its safety reporting to hide it. Claire read the paragraph 3 times. Thomas Foster had died in a car accident before the story ran. The investigation died with him. No publication, no follow-up, no archive of his work anywhere she could find. It had simply ceased to exist, the way things do when nobody is left to carry them. She sat back in her father's chair and remembered something she had not thought about in years. There had been a stretch when she was in her early 20s, when George came home late again and again with a particular expression on his face. Meetings that were on no calendar, calls he took in the garage. She had asked him once what was wrong, and he said that running a company sometimes meant carrying things alone, and never said another word about it. She assumed it was money. Everyone assumed it was money. She called legal and asked them to locate everything the company still held on Thomas Foster and the Tacoma facility. The request went in at 4:11 in the afternoon. At 6:20, her personal phone rang from a number with no identity attached to it. The voice was male, flat, unhurried. "If you have any respect left for your father, don't dig up the Foster business." The line went dead. She called back twice. It didn't ring at all. Caleb got home at 11:40 that same night and knew before he had the key out that his door was already open. Nothing was gone. That was the first thing he registered, and the thing that put a cold weight in his stomach. Television on the stand, laptop on the counter, wallet with $60 in the dish by the door, untouched. But the closet in the back room had been emptied onto the floor, and every box he had kept from his father's estate had been opened and gone through. Notebooks, cassette tapes, folders of clippings 15 years old. Whoever had done it had been thorough, and they had wanted him to know they had looked. Because on the kitchen table, arranged in the center where he could not miss it, was a photograph of Thomas Foster from the year before he died. Laid beside it, fanned out like a hand of cards, were 4 ivory envelopes. Caleb stood in his own kitchen with his coat still on. He had seen envelopes exactly like that held above a woman's head 3 nights earlier while 400 people laughed at him. At almost the same hour, Claire opened an email from an address that was a string of characters and nothing else. No subject, 1 attachment, a photograph scanned from a print, the colors gone warm with age. 2 men shaking hands in what looked like a parking structure, both turned partly from the camera, both caught mid-conversation. One of them was George Whitmore, the other was Thomas Foster. Claire brought the screen closer. What unsettled her was not that they knew each other. It was the way they stood. Her father's other hand rested on the journalist's shoulder. Neither man looked angry or cornered or caught. They did not look like enemies. They looked like 2 men who had agreed on something and were being careful about who found out. Claire found him on a Wednesday night in the service corridor on the 4th floor, and she came alone, which was the first thing Caleb noticed. No assistant, no security, just the chief executive of Whitmore Industries standing under a fluorescent light beside a rolling bin, holding a printed photograph. He set down the bottle in his hand and took it. The recognition went through him hard enough that Claire saw it happen. "My father had this one," Caleb said. "Same shot. He kept it in a book and never explained it to me." Every version of this conversation she had built in her head involved careful questions. All of it collapsed. Explained what? "He told me about a week before the accident that he'd found proof Whitmore Industries knew about the contamination in Tacoma and buried it deliberately. Not a mistake at a plant. A decision made by people with names." Caleb handed the photograph back. "Then he was dead, everything he had was gone, and nobody at any paper in this state would return a call from his son." "So you looked." "For years." He said it the way a man reports mileage on a car. "The academic work went first. Everything else went with it. 18 months ago, a contract vendor put me in this building 4 nights a week, and I took the job partly because I thought if anything my father left behind still existed, it existed inside these walls. And 18 months and I've never gotten past a badge reader. I empty the trash on the executive floor. I've never once been allowed into a room that mattered." She told him about the phone call, the flat voice, and the number that didn't ring back. Then Caleb drove her to his apartment, turned on the light, and let her see the boxes across the floor, the notebooks, the photograph of Thomas on the kitchen table, and the 4 ivory envelopes fanned out beside it. Claire went very still. She took her own envelope out of her bag and set it down next to them. Identical paper, identical age. "They wanted you to see this," she said. "They wanted me to know they'd been inside." Caleb was looking at her, not the table. "But they took nothing, so the break-in wasn't about what I have." "Then what?" "Timing. Nobody threatened me for 18 months. Nobody threatened you for 10 years. It started 3 days after a video of the two of us went online." The thought arrived in both of them at once. Somebody was not afraid of Claire Whitmore alone, and not afraid of Caleb Foster alone. What frightened them was the two of them in the same room. "There's an old archive," Claire said. "Physical records, pre-digital, everything from Tacoma should still be in it." Caleb didn't answer right away, and she understood why. She was the woman who had held a letter over his head and invited 400 people to laugh. She was the heir to the family he had spent a decade believing destroyed his own. "You want me to walk into your father's company with you. I want to know what my father was doing in that photograph." He looked at the boxes on the floor, 15 years of dead ends, and at the one door he had never been able to open, standing in his kitchen offering him a key. "All right," Caleb said. The archive occupied 2 floors of a leased building in Georgetown, and the man who ran it had been running it since before Claire was born. Walter Briggs was somewhere past 60, reading glasses pushed up into thin gray hair, and he was perfectly pleasant until Claire said the word Tacoma. Then his hand stopped moving on the counter. "Those files are sealed." "By whom?" "By your father, personally. He came down here himself, which he never did, and signed the order in front of me." Walter's eyes went to Caleb, then back. "That was a long time ago, Miss Whitmore." "I'm the chief executive. I know exactly who you are." He held her gaze longer than a records manager should, and what crossed his face looked less like obstruction than warning. Then he went and got the keys. They worked in a windowless room with a metal table under a bad light, and for 3 hours Claire felt foolish because the files were clean, immaculately clean. A minor process incident. Groundwater testing within all applicable limits. No long-term consequences identified. Every protocol followed, every box marked. "This is wrong," Caleb said. "It's all here." "That's what's wrong." He turned a folder toward her. "My father spent 22 months on this. He had lab reports contradicting the company's numbers. He told me that himself. Those reports aren't in this room, not disputed, not rebutted. They simply don't exist here. You don't get a record this perfect by accident. You get it by building it." They kept going past midnight. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, Caleb ran his thumb along the inside back cover of a bound facility binder and felt a ridge. A security access log folded flat behind the board and glued at one edge. Not lost, hidden by someone who wanted it to survive. He opened it under the lamp, handwritten visitor entries going back years. The same name appeared again and again down the left column. Thomas Foster, Thomas Foster, Thomas Foster. He was inside this archive, Caleb said, repeatedly. That's not possible. He was investigating the company from outside. Then somebody was letting him in. He turned to the last page and stopped. The final entry was a formal access request, signed at the bottom, for a document described as an independent environmental assessment, the outside study, not the internal one. Thomas Foster's signature sat under it in dark ink. Claire leaned in to read the date, then read it again, then pulled the log under the light because her mind had rejected it twice. Caleb. He was already looking. The request had been signed 9 days after Thomas Foster was declared dead. Caleb's hand went flat on the page, holding it down as if it might move. He had grown up watching that handwriting appear on school forms and on the backs of photographs. That's my father's writing. Everything he had chased for more than a decade rearranged itself in 1 second. He had come into this building wanting to know what his father discovered. Now the question was different. If Thomas Foster signed this 9 days after he died, who was in the casket? The independent assessment had been ordered through a private medical office, and the account belonged to a physician who had been George Whitmore's personal doctor and friend for 30 years. Harold Mercer had retired to Bainbridge Island and had not spoken about the Whitmore family since the funeral. He answered the door and was gracious for about 90 seconds. He offered coffee. He said kind things about George. Then Caleb laid the access log on the table, opened to the last page, and turned it so the signature and the date sat side by side. Harold looked at it and his face went the color of the paper. "I don't know what that is." "You ordered the report it's requesting," Claire said. "It went through your office." "That's an old file, and files get—" "Doctor." Caleb didn't raise his voice. 9 days. Explain 9 days. The old man sat down slowly, and what came out had the flatness of something rehearsed alone for years and never said out loud. "Your father survived the crash." Caleb didn't move. "He wasn't supposed to. It was arranged so he wouldn't." Harold's hands were folded hard together. "By the time he got to me, he'd been under a false name for 11 hours, and he was in very bad condition, and he was still trying to tell me about the reports." He explained it in pieces. Thomas Foster had gotten past the public story into the real one. A group inside Whitmore Industries had known for years that the Tacoma groundwater was contaminated, had commissioned safety studies and then had them rewritten, and had kept the plant running through 3 regulatory reviews. When the journalists got close to the one document that would prove it, somebody with real authority inside the corporation gave an instruction about him. "And the man who pulled him out," Harold said, "was George." Claire's voice came out thin. "My father. George found out what was going to happen and he couldn't stop it. He wasn't strong enough, not then. Half that board was in it and he didn't know which half." Harold looked up. "So he did the only thing available. He got Thomas out of the wreck, brought him to me, and the 2 of us buried a man who wasn't there. It was the only way to make them stop hunting him." Caleb sat with his hands on his knees and said nothing at all. For more than 10 years he had carried one fact in his chest like a stone. The name Whitmore had killed his father. He had taken a job pushing a cart through their hallways because of that fact. He had been humiliated in their atrium because of it. And a Whitmore had saved Thomas Foster's life. Claire was undone in a different direction. She had grown up with a man she believed was ice all the way through, who chose the company over her mother, over holidays, over almost everything, and who once told her that a corporation only survives if somebody is willing to be hated for it. She had spent 3 years trying to be that man. He had been fighting his own board in secret the entire time. "Who gave the order?" Caleb said. "I never knew a name. George wouldn't tell me. He said knowing it would put me in the ground next." Harold rubbed his face. "But he told me one thing and made me remember it. The person's signature is on the falsified environmental report. The real one and the fake one both exist. The fake one has a name at the bottom." From that moment, neither of them was investigating the past anymore. They were hunting someone who might still be sitting inside Whitmore Industries. The corporate data vault was accessible only from the executive floor, and Claire brought him in at 11 at night on her own badge, past a lobby desk that logged her name and not his. Her credentials failed on the second directory. Authorization above executive level required. She stared at it. She had signed off on a $400 million acquisition from this terminal. There was a tier of this company built so that its chief executive could not see inside it, and she had been sitting on top of it for 3 years without knowing. But she knew the legacy recovery architecture George designed in the 1990s, because he had walked her through it once when she was 22 and bored, and she had remembered it the way you remember a song. 40 minutes later, a directory opened that was indexed nowhere, Project Phoenix. It was all there, laid out with the terrible tidiness of people who never expected to be read. Laboratory results with the original values still visible in the revision history and new values written over them. Payments routed through 2 shell entities in Delaware, contracts with a private security firm, surveillance logs on Thomas Foster, his car, his home, the diner where he ate breakfast, internal assessments of the communities downstream of the plant, written in the language of liability rather than illness, and a directive 3 lines long using the phrase permanent containment in reference to what it called the journalist problem. Then they found the real environmental assessment, not the one in the archive, the one that had been ordered, delivered, read, and replaced. The groundwater had been contaminated for years, badly, and everyone who signed the second version had known it. Claire scrolled to the approval page. One signature at the bottom. Margaret Caldwell, chair of the board, her father's closest friend for 4 decades. The woman who had stood beside Claire at George's funeral with a hand on her back, who had run this company for 7 years and then handed it to her, who had put her hand flat on Claire's back at the gala and told her to smile and let her handle the rest. No, Claire said it quietly, which was worse than shouting. Signatures get forged. That's the easiest thing in the world to fake. Caleb did not argue. He had stood where she was standing, and he knew nothing anyone said would move her an inch. Then keep looking. Every road went to the same place. The security firm retained under her authority, surveillance orders carrying her approval code, shell payments clearing through an account she controlled, a communication strategy 40 pages long dedicated to discrediting Thomas Foster professionally before publication, sourced, funded, and signed by her. Claire went faster and faster, and she was no longer looking for the truth. She was looking for one document, any document, that would let Margaret Caldwell be innocent. What she found instead was George Whitmore's final calendar. She opened it because it was the last unexamined file, read down the last week of her father's life, stopped at the bottom entry, and felt the blood leave her face. The last private meeting George Whitmore ever took, the night before he died, was with Margaret Caldwell. Claire's mouth opened and nothing came out of it. The screen went red. Unauthorized access detected. Project Phoenix vanished, folder by folder, and Claire's credentials were revoked while her hand was still on the mouse. The office door locked with a heavy mechanical sound. The desk phone gave nothing. Her cell had no bars, and neither did his. Down the hall, the elevator panel went dark. Somewhere below them, a stairwell door opened, and then another. The speaker in the ceiling clicked on, and Margaret Caldwell's voice came into the room as calmly as if she were opening a meeting. She did not deny anything. That was the part Claire would remember longest. Margaret said she had done what was necessary to protect a corporation that fed thousands of families, that George had always been sentimental about costs he never had to pay himself, and that history would eventually be grateful even if this room never was. Then she explained what would happen. Caleb Foster would be arrested tonight for unauthorized entry into a secure system and theft of proprietary data. His file was already prepared for the press. A contract janitor working nights who had been quietly searching the building for months and who happened to be the son of a journalist with a documented grievance against Whitmore Industries. By tomorrow afternoon, he would not be a man who found the truth. He would be a disgruntled worker who came for revenge. Claire would be removed by the board before sunrise. An emergency session was already being convened. The gala video would be entered as evidence of a chief executive losing control in public, and the fact that she had personally escorted an unauthorized contractor into the data vault at 11 at night would finish it. By tomorrow, Margaret said, you'll be a woman who fell apart. He'll be a thief, and no one will believe a single word either of you ever says again. Then she added the last thing. Your father thought the truth mattered more than Whitmore Industries, too. He paid for that mistake. Claire stood there with the dead screen in front of her and the calendar entry still burning behind her eyes. Caleb checked the drive in the terminal. The copy had stopped partway through. He had no way of knowing whether what was on it proved anything at all. The footsteps in the corridor were getting closer. Caleb went at the door first because the door was the only thing in the room that was mechanical. He got the faceplate off the panel with a letter opener and found what he expected. An electromagnetic lock with no manual release on the interior side, drawing power from a circuit he could not reach. He tried anyway for 90 seconds, then stopped because 90 seconds was all he could afford to spend on something that wasn't going to work. Claire was at the terminal entering her override code. The one that existed for exactly this kind of night. The one no board could revoke without a formal vote. Access revoked. She entered it again, slower, and got the same 3 words. Caleb pulled the drive and moved to the second terminal, trying to push what he had out through anything: internal mail, the document system, a shared drive, any pipe leading out of the building. Every attempt died at the same wall. The network had been severed above them. Claire moved along the perimeter with her hand on the wall, checking the utility closet, the private washroom, the panel behind the credenza. There was no second exit. This was the top of the corporation, and it had one way in. The radios were audible now, and under them the flat rhythm of men walking without hurrying, which was somehow worse than running. 3 minutes, Claire said. Maybe 4. She turned around and decided fast, the way she decided in board meetings. I'll go out. They want me removed by morning, not carried out. They'll have to talk to me, and that's time. Take the drive and find a way down. No. Caleb, if you walk out that door alone, Margaret has the room. You're the only person alive who can say she was in this building tonight and say it as the chief executive. The second you're outside and I'm inside, I'm a thief who took a woman hostage with her own badge. She writes both of us in one paragraph. Claire didn't answer because he was right, and because for the first time in her life she was standing in a situation with no reasonable option in it. No leverage, no favor to call, no name to drop. Caleb looked around the office, really looked, the way he had looked at 400 rooms in this building over 18 months, and his eyes stopped on the bookcase behind the desk, George Whitmore's bookcase, untouched in 10 years because Claire had never been able to move it. A thought surfaced, so simple it arrived fully formed. A man who spent years secretly fighting his own board would not design an office with only one way out. Claire, your father. Did he ever say anything about exits? About being trapped? She was about to say no. Then something came up out of a memory so old it had almost dissolved. A summer afternoon, her father showing her the recovery architecture on a green terminal screen, and George turning to her at the end with an expression she hadn't understood. Every system has to have a second road, Claire. Build one, or someday you'll find yourself standing in a room somebody else controls. She repeated it out loud. He said that to me once. I thought he was talking about servers. He wasn't. Caleb was scanning the shelves, and there was nothing there. Biographies, industry histories, engineering texts, the ordinary library of an ordinary rich man. Then he saw them. One volume on power, one on human decency, one with the word shadow in the title. Power, humanity, shadow. The exact 3 ideas, in the exact order, from 4 lines of Latin in a woman's envelope. The letter Claire Whitmore had raised over her head in front of 400 laughing people to prove that a janitor was nothing. He pressed the 3 spines in the order of the sentence, pushing each until it sat flush with the back of the case. Nothing happened. Out in the corridor, the footsteps stopped, directly outside the door. A radio said something short, and then a card was tried against the reader. Claire looked at him with everything gone out of her face. Caleb closed his eyes and rebuilt the Latin in his mind, clause by clause. He had read it under a spotlight in the atrium and translated it for a room that had just stopped laughing. And the sentence did not run in the order the ideas appeared in English. In the Latin, the shadow came before the humanity. The clause about what power casts sat inside the clause about the man who forgets. He reversed the last 2. Power, shadow, humanity. Click. A section of the bookcase came off the wall by half an inch. It swung out onto a narrow, unlit corridor with a concrete floor, and at the end an old service elevator with a brass panel and a key slot from a version of the building that no longer appeared on any floor plan. They were through and pulling the case shut behind them when the office door came in. Getting out of the building solved the next 20 minutes and nothing beyond them. They sat in Claire's car in a parking garage 6 blocks away at 4 in the morning with the drive on the console between them. Everything that survived the interrupted copy was intact. Not all of Project Phoenix, but the falsified assessment, the real one, the surveillance logs, the shell payments, and the directive with permanent containment in it. Enough to end the company. Claire understood that with total clarity. If she released it, Whitmore Industries would not survive. Not the stock, not the structure, not the name on the building. Thousands of people who had never heard of Tacoma would lose their jobs. 40 years of her father's work would come apart in public. And if she kept it, she would become the next person in her family to sit on top of a lie and call it stewardship. This was the whole of it. The woman who had ruined a man in front of a ballroom over a stained dress now had to decide whether she was willing to destroy her own power to protect something that would give her nothing back. Caleb did not push her. A decision she was pushed into would not hold when the lawyers came. What he said instead, watching the sky start to go gray over the concrete, was the thing he had not said in 11 days. You didn't have to come down to the 4th floor alone. I owed you that much. You owed me an apology. I know. Claire kept her eyes on the windshield. I've been trying to find a version of it that doesn't sound like I'm asking you to make me feel better. There isn't one. No, she said. I don't think there is. She sat with that. Then she picked up the drive. If this company can only exist by burying people under its own secrets, then the thing worth saving isn't the company. The technologists they found lived in Ballard and had spent 11 years building the very systems that locked them in. Dale Renner had left Whitmore Industries 4 years earlier over something he never explained publicly, and when Claire told him what was on the drive, he did not ask a single question about the risk. He authenticated the files, verified the metadata chains, mirrored everything in 4 places, and distributed it simultaneously to 3 newspapers, the State Environmental Agency, the federal office with the jurisdiction over the Tacoma watershed, 2 plaintiffs' firms, and a criminal investigative unit. The board's emergency session convened at 7 that morning to remove her. It was still in progress when the first newsroom called for comment. By the time the vote was taken, removing Claire Whitmore had stopped being a governance action and started looking like the last act of a board trying to bury a criminal investigation, and 4 directors abstained rather than have their names on it. The warrant against Caleb was signed and never served. Within 48 hours, the party claiming to be the victim of the theft was itself under federal investigation, and no prosecutor in the state wanted to be the one who charged the son of Thomas Foster. Project Phoenix detonated on a Thursday. Whitmore Industries opened down 31% and kept falling. The board issued a statement about fabricated materials obtained through unauthorized access. Margaret Caldwell appeared outside her attorney's office, composed and gracious, and said the documents were forgeries produced by an executive in the middle of a personal crisis and a contract employee with a grudge. Claire watched an empire with her family's name on it come apart on a television screen and did not take back a word. But Caleb saw the problem forming before anyone else. Documents can be argued with. Metadata can be disputed by a well-paid expert. A signature can be called a forgery for as long as a defense attorney keeps saying it, and Margaret had already started saying it. What could not be argued with was a man. They found him through money, because money is the only thing that cannot fully disappear. George Whitmore had established a small private trust 2 months after the funeral, and it had made quiet quarterly disbursements for years to an account paying property taxes on a parcel in eastern Washington. Harold Mercer's insurance filings had a matching gap in the same period. 11 days after Project Phoenix broke, they drove 4 hours over the pass to a house at the end of a dirt road, pines on 3 sides, no neighbors within a mile. Caleb went in alone. The room was small and warm and full of books, and a man with white hair sat in a chair by the window with a blanket across his knees. He looked up. Thomas Foster was alive. He was 71 years old, and he had been alive the entire time. Caleb crossed the room and put his arms around his father and held on and then stepped back and could not look at him. You let me bury you. I know. I stood at that funeral. I emptied your house. I gave away your coats. His voice stayed level, which made it worse. 13 years believing they killed you. I threw away everything I had trying to prove it. Thomas did not defend himself. He did not say it had been the only way, though it had been, and both of them knew it. I protected you, he said. That doesn't mean I didn't hurt you. Caleb sat down across from him, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and no forgiveness was offered or given that afternoon. Then Caleb put the access log on the table, opened to the last page. Why did you sign your own name? You were supposed to be dead. Because a false name would have meant nothing to you. Thomas touched the edge of the page. I knew you'd look, maybe not for a year, maybe not for 10, but I knew that somewhere in that archive you'd find a date that couldn't be explained, and my handwriting under it, and you'd know I was somewhere. Then why not just come home? Because the people hunting me never stopped, and the day I surfaced, you'd have been standing next to me. Thomas's hands were flat on the blanket, so I watched from here. I knew where you worked. I knew when you took the job in that building, and I knew why. Caleb understood before his father finished. The envelopes. Nobody threatened you, son. Nobody was looking for anything in that apartment. Thomas met his eyes. When that video went online, I saw the two of you in one frame for the first time in 13 years, a Whitmore and a Foster, and she was holding George's letter. That was the only chance either of you was ever going to get. So I sent a man in to leave you something you couldn't ignore, and I sent her the photograph. I couldn't tell you. If I'd walked in that door, you'd have spent the next month protecting me instead of finishing it. Then he told the rest. George had pulled him from the wreck and hidden him with Harold's help. Margaret Caldwell had built and run Project Phoenix from the beginning, authorized the falsified assessments, retained the security firm, ordered the surveillance. And George had spent the last 3 years of his life quietly assembling enough directors to remove her, carefully, one at a time, because he could not be certain which of them she owned. He had not finished. He died first. Thomas brought back an old wooden box and set it on the table. Inside were ivory envelopes, a dozen of them, the same soft-cornered paper. He wrote that line out over and over. For years, he'd send them to me. Thomas closed the lid. He said it was the only way he could keep hold of the thing he was afraid of losing. Claire had come in by then and stood behind Caleb's chair, looking down at the box. Her father had written that sentence to himself again and again as a warning that power becomes dangerous at the exact moment a person starts using it to justify hurting someone. She had taken one of those envelopes to a gala. She had raised it above her head. She had used her father's private confession as a weapon to prove that a man who cleaned floors was beneath her. She had been holding the warning about herself, and she had turned it into a joke at his expense. Thomas agreed to testify. What followed came apart the way these things always do, which is from the inside. Thomas Foster broke 13 years of silence, and his statement forced the state to reopen the Tacoma file, which meant subpoenas instead of requests. Once the subpoenas moved, Harold Mercer understood that silence no longer protected anyone, not George, who was dead, and not Thomas, who was on the record, and he testified to the falsified death. Walter Briggs, who had watched George seal those files with his own hands, turned over the original archive logs, including visitor records nobody had ever thought to ask him about. Then it accelerated because former employees who had spent a decade calculating exactly what Margaret Caldwell could do to them ran the calculation again and got a different answer. Emails surfaced. Lab technicians who had been told to revise numbers produced the original files. A regional manager brought out 4 years of memoranda he had kept in a storage unit for reasons he could not explain. The architecture of fear Margaret had built collapsed from within, and it collapsed fast, because it had never been held up by loyalty. The final chain connected her to the falsification of the environmental reports, to illegal surveillance of a private citizen, to the conspiracy to silence Thomas Foster, and to obstruction of the investigation that followed. Margaret Caldwell was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Whitmore Industries was investigated, broken apart, and restructured under supervision. A compensation fund was established for the communities downstream of the Tacoma plant, the ones whose names had appeared in Project Phoenix only as projected liability figures. Claire testified publicly under oath for 2 days. Near the end, an attorney asked whether she understood that her cooperation had cost her control of the corporation her family founded. "Yes," Claire said. "And do you regret it?" She thought about a ballroom with 400 people in it, and an envelope held over her head and a man taking off his gloves. No. After the investigation closed, Claire Whitmore formally stepped down as chief executive. She sold most of what she still held in the restructured company and moved the money into environmental remediation, whistleblower defense, and legal aid for contract workers. She did it quietly, and when a reporter tried to write it as a redemption story, she declined to be interviewed. A large donation was not a payment. She knew the difference. What her father had understood too late, and what she was only beginning to understand, was that change is not one beautiful act that erases a history. It is the same choice made again the next morning and the morning after that, for as long as a person keeps having to make it. Caleb never collected the $1 million, and he never went back to the 4th floor. After years of leaving what he knew in a box, he took work with an organization that represents laborers and whistleblowers against large corporations, people who walk into rooms where everyone assumes they are nothing. He and Thomas rebuilt slowly. There was no immediate forgiveness, and Thomas never once used, "I was protecting you," to erase the years his son had spent living with a death that hadn't happened. Some Sundays they sat in the small warm room with the pines outside and said very little, and that was the shape of it for a long time. Claire saw him again almost a year later at a community event in Tacoma. No entourage, no gala stage, no distance between a chief executive and a janitor, because neither of those people existed anymore. "Technically," Claire said, "I still owe you $1 million. Caleb looked at her. "You paid something more expensive than money." She understood. She had lost the title. She had lost the company. She had lost the certainty that her family had always been on the right side of its own story, and it was only after losing those things that she began to understand what her father had been trying to say. On the night of that gala, Claire had raised the letter over her head to prove how small a janitor was. But Caleb Foster had never needed the letter to prove his worth. The letter only exposed how blind Claire had been. The value of a person is not in the uniform they wear, the title on their card, or the money in their account. Caleb was the same man before and after Claire discovered he could read Latin. The only thing that changed was how she saw him. A person can stand at the top of a corporation and still become small if power makes them stop seeing the dignity of the people below. Because real power is not measured by how many people have to obey you. It is measured by how you treat the ones who have no power to make you kind.